Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
So, Marcus, I hate to think about this, but I'm only 5 weeks away from coming back to London.
I missed you, and I missed our wines.
Yes. You do know, and I always think about this. It was many a night sitting outside a pub over many glasses of wine, maybe 1 or 2 bottles of wine, that got us to really understand that there were great conversations to be had. And that got us to where we are today on this podcast. But enough of our kind of love-a-thon. Who are we talking to?
Yes, so today we talk to Mark Schwartz. He is an enterprise strategist or ex-CIO or similar to Amazon AWS services. So he works for a nice big company. He's got an amazing track record and very interesting work over at the US government as well. And his book is called The Delicate Art of Bureaucracy. So he talks about bureaucracy, pros and cons, and how he worked his way around it, or with it, or through it. So, but before I babble again, or ramble again, now I'm doing it. What were your insights?
Yeah. So I really enjoyed the book. B, I didn't realize that he'd written 3 other books. So there's a total of 4 books. I'm going to have to add those to my reading list. My takeaways from today are, number 1, not all bureaucracy is bad. There's a lot of bureaucracy that's in our lives that is invisible to us because it works for us instead of working against us. And so kind of this, tarring all bureaucracy as bad is the wrong approach. And I think that's a really important way to look at it. And the other thing is, don't try to do an end run on bureaucracy if you can use bureaucracy on itself. And he talks about kind of the trap door in MD 102, Management Directive
Yeah, I
102,
remember that one.
which he talks a lot about in the book.
It's so Kafkaesque. It's ridiculous.
Yes, it is. It is very. But that, and of course, his 3 main characters: the monkey, the razor, and the sumo wrestler. But before I give away any more, what were your takeaways?
Yes. Well, apart from we both love the book. This is a great book that is really valuable even outside IT, for sure. As a designer, I say this. As working in lots of different areas in organization, I say this. So one of the things, therefore, is for me to talk to my designer friends or people who are sitting with new practices coming to organizations like behavior science, whatever, and proving what their value is. It's quite... The one thing you pointed out is show how you can de-risk things, because bureaucracy wants to de-risk first and foremost. That's why it's most of the time in place. So if you can make a case how you're de-risking and how you're delivering on the de-risking and following the guidelines that are in place, if you can maneuver around that, you're golden. You will get what you want. You'll be able to do your job. So that's one of my insights, which is lovely. And I think a lot of practices can learn from that to start speaking that language. I think the other one, I'm looking at my notes, and I nearly lost my notes here, right? So one was about design, and the other one
Well, it's
was
so dark over there,
about...
Marcus. So, I know you're trying to do moody with your skateboards in the background, but if you can't read your notes...
No, I can't read my notes. I'm just have so many notes here that I took from the interview. I think the other one is around... I think it's just a little story. Because when we were talking to him, I had about 5, 6, 7 stories in my head that I could so relate to, or across multiple industries, working in multiple positions, always trying to have to get a way through to make things happen. One of them was about procurement. So I was working at an advertising agency around procurement with P&G, and they basically had, this is the list of suppliers you can have to build this. And we knew from the get-go, like, those people can't deliver. Because you look at their profile and what they can build, impossible, right? So you go, well, we're not going to be able to build this. But there was an exception, meaning that, oh, well, if they can have those capabilities and those skill sets, then you can pick your own supplier. It's like, great. So we just reject the requirements to the point where it was evident that we needed a different supplier, and therefore managed to be able to choose our own supplier off the given procurement list. So it's really, really important in this case. And Mark was saying the same thing. He started a job at the government, and there was all these documents to read, and they seemingly had nothing to do with what his job in IT was all about. But as he found out a few days later, it was really important to read those documents because they threw all sorts of spanner into his works. And knowing the rules and then being able to be creatively working around it makes things happen, and you can work even within the guardrails of bureaucracy. So know the rules and you might get lucky. So that's my second takeaway, and
And
I will start there.
the rules are for our intro, it's under 5 minutes. We're breaking the rules. What should we do, Marcus?
Yeah, go to the. Well, is it a rule? Is it a rule? Are we being bureaucratic now? Let's go to the interview. Hello, everyone. Today we have Mark Schwartz with us. Hello, Mark. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here.
So, as usually, we start from the top. So, please tell our listeners who you are and why you wrote the book.
Okay. My name is Mark Schwartz. I am currently an enterprise strategist with AWS. It's a strange title. The idea of the position is that I'm part of a small team of people who used to be CIOs or CTOs or other senior executives of large enterprises. And all of us did a digital transformation of some sort. We all did a large scale cloud migration. And our job really is to work with AWS customers, generally large enterprises, generally senior level executives, to try to help them deal with some of the non technical but very real challenges in transformation. So, I mean, things like cultural change and organizational structure and organizational politics and governance models, investment strategies, upskilling, all the things that are really hard because technical stuff we know is easy, right? So I before I joined AWS, I was the CIO at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And that's part of the Department of Homeland Security. It was my only time in government, and it was a fascinating experience. I learned a lot about working in a big bureaucracy and getting a transformation done there, having come from the private sector right before that. So I've published 4 books now generally on IT leadership and on how senior executives who are not IT people should be working with their IT organizations.
Great. So I said at the beginning, even before we started recording, that both Marcus and myself both really enjoyed the book. I have to say that I recommended your book now twice already. So
Thank you.
this is really, really good. The first question that we've got lined up is: it seems like you've taken some of your inspiration from Sun Tzu and the Art of War, which I read, but I read that many years ago, and as I said, I've slept since then, so I've forgotten more than I remembered. But one of the things your publisher talks about is at the end of the book, we're not sure if he likes bureaucracy or not. And I'm like, okay, so we're going to start with, tell us what is your definition of bureaucracy?
So I have to admit, I wrote some of those things that my publisher says, and I deliberately put that one in because I wanted to make the point that bureaucracy isn't really something you like or dislike. It's a thing. It's like the law of gravity. You can't like it or dislike it. Things fall. That's just the way it is. So the definition that I used is a simplified version of the standard academic definition, which comes from the sociologist Max Weber, who was writing around 1920. And he lists a lot of characteristics that he considers to be the essence of bureaucracy. But what it really comes down to, for me, is a bureaucracy is a kind of social organization, first of all, that involves rigid rules, rules that are applied universally without exception, and rigid roles, meaning there's a division of labor, people have accountability for a certain area, and they're chosen based on their expertise in that area, chosen by merit. So, to really boil it down, it's a social organization with rigid rules and rigid roles. And that's kind of the working definition that I use.
So when we're looking at that, and you obviously so you use the word rigidity a fair amount, and if we're looking at any news article, any IT article, any kind of design, whatever organizational article, everyone talks about flexibility, agility, and sounds to be a bit counter to rigidity. So if we're talking about experimentation and some of the most prominent companies of our days and one you're working for, they experiment, they try different things. It's more about effectiveness than efficiency. um, how do you match this? So how do you match this between how much bureaucracy, because it's taking down the ability to experiment and be flexible, but we all need a center point, and rigidity is something we can agree on, right, to some extent. Otherwise we can't communicate even. So how do you square that?
Uh, so I thought a lot about that. And what I realized is these are not opposites, they're not in opposition. Where we want flexibility, where we want agility, is in our ability to change course rapidly, to innovate creative solutions, to inspect and adapt, essentially, to keep making decisions as we see how things are going. And that agility is absolutely crucial in every organization. It turns out that one of the best ways to get that agility there is to have somewhat rigid guardrails and structures in place. So you'll find that a lot of organizations that use agile approaches to IT, for example, use some sort of guiding structure or framework. Maybe it's like Scrum, 2 week increments, 2 week iterations, and daily stand ups and things like that. There's structure around it. Or in DevOps, where we use automated integration builds, deployments, a lot of automation, which is rigid if you think about it. It just works in a certain way and you don't keep changing that. Being able to do those things is what gives you the true agility and flexibility. Often I'm asked by executives that I talk to, how can we have control over what's going on if there's agility? How can, for example, with security, how can we make sure that the code that these agile teams are producing is secure? And the answer is you do it with rigidity. You have guardrails. You have automated security tests that keep getting applied. You have automated policy enforcement in your cloud environment. All of these things are, in a way, they're examples of bureaucracy. They're an automated kind of bureaucracy. But if you have those guardrails in place, then people can be as creative as they want and move as fast as they want because they can't get outside the guardrails.
Mm. So it's interesting. The guardrails, as you describe it, give the structure, and yet a lot of people look at the structure and say it's confining and it's limiting. In the book, you talk about a few different things. You've got the concept of the monkey, the razor, and the sumo wrestler. And I was talking with Marcus a bit earlier about using bureaucracy's weight against itself in the sumo wrestler. I think Occam's razor and the idea that perfection is achieved not when there's nothing left to be added, but when there's nothing left to be removed, is something near and dear to my heart. It's like I'm Captain No when it comes to new features and the idea of introducing chaos. Can you tell us a bit about the monkey, the razor, and the sumo wrestler, and you can read the book, or anyone can read the book and learn about them, but how did you come up with these as concepts?
Yeah. Well, just to back up a little on what you started out with there, people do resist bureaucracy, but one of the points that I was trying to make is a lot of bureaucracy passes unnoticed. There's a lot of it around us all the time, and we don't object to it because it's not getting in our way. And
Mm.
so I try to distinguish between bureaucracy that gets in your way and bureaucracy that doesn't, or I say good bureaucracy versus evil bureaucracy. Either way, the evil bureaucracy has certain characteristics that are not necessary for bureaucracy. There are certain characteristics that tend to get added to bureaucracy that cause us all the pain that we experience. And if you can take those characteristics and get rid of them or turn them into the positive equivalents or not analogs, the corresponding positives, then you can actually make the bureaucracy work for you in many cases rather than against you. The key to doing so, I think, is the monkey, the razor, and the sumo wrestler, obviously. I started not with those three ideas exactly, or maybe they were, subconsciously in my head or something. I started by going back over the techniques that I had used to deal with bureaucracy in the government environment where it's very strong. And I put together this playbook of, something like 30 or so techniques that we used to change bad bureaucracy into good bureaucracy so that we could be flexible and get the agility we wanted. And then I looked at those 30 or so plays and I said, this is interesting. They sort of divide themselves into three groups. There are really three almost personalities behind them or ways of thinking. And I gave a name to each of those groups that I think sums it up. And those names were the monkey, the razor, and the sumo wrestler. I realized that let's take the monkey first. The monkeys traditionally are playful, mischievous, provocative. Almost, so many cultures have this trickster character in their mythology or their legends, and it's very often a monkey. So the monkey techniques for dealing with bureaucracy have to do with being mischievous in a way, being a little provocative. For example, taking some liberties in how they obey the rules. So I called it provoke and observe. I borrowed that phrase from somewhere. Provoke and observe, the same way as we say inspect and adapt in the agile world. The monkey does that, provokes and looks to see what happens. So a bunch of the techniques that I associated with the monkey are that kind of provocation. And observation, let's say. The razor sums up another group of those techniques because they all have to do with trying to make things that are wasteful leaner. So turning
Mm.
bloat into leanness, let's say. So trimming away the fat is a way to think about what the razor does. And that includes standard lean approaches, based on lean manufacturing and Toyota production system, but also some other ways that I discovered that you can be leaner in a bureaucratic environment. And then the sumo wrestler is the fun one for me as well. The sumo wrestler is about turning bureaucracy back on itself. And I was surprised to discover that you can do that, actually, that bureaucracy can often be your ally in defeating bureaucracy. And the example from my experience is that we were faced with this big bureaucratic process called MD 102, Management Directive 102. And we had to follow this, huge, well defined, rigid process for everything we did in IT. And it involved writing 87 documents and going through 11 gate reviews to get permission to move on to the next step and define 22 different oversight roles. It was just this huge machine of a thing. And one of the things we did to get to be able to work within it was we created our own bureaucratic policy. And our bureaucratic policy only involved 2 gate reviews instead of 11, and only 15 documents instead of 87. And we knew we could do even better than that, but that was a start. And it was very formal. It was written in bureaucratic language. It was beautiful. It's like a work of art when you master the tools. And we realized that often auditors, what they're doing is they're comparing your policy with what you're actually doing in practice and making sure they're the same. So we realized that the auditors would actually be enforcing our new policy if we did this right, if we pulled the right levers. And so in fact, the auditors were enforcing that everybody followed really good IT practices, what I would consider good practices. So that's an example of the sumo wrestler. This is
But,
turning the strength of bureaucracy around.
but what was the back door?
The backdoor, it was partly that nobody questioned it because they love to see a formal policy written down. But it was also a mapping, essentially. A thing we did once that proved that we were satisfying all of the requirements of the big thing with our smaller thing. And that mapping we didn't have to do every time. We only had to do it once. And it was a little struggle to get people to agree that, in fact, it did accomplish the right things. But once we did, then everything was streamlined.
So what am I remembering? Because the backdoor that I was thinking of was in MD 102, there was a bureaucratic policy for an exception.
Yes.
And it was
Totally.
the exception that allowed you to exploit and create your own bureaucracy.
Yes. So that was not actually the backdoor for writing this policy, but it was the backdoor for the streamlining itself. And yes, the way that worked is almost every good piece of bureaucracy has some sort of backdoor because the people who write it aren't crazy. So MD 102 said you have to follow everything in this document, all these crazy things, unless you create a project tailoring plan and get it approved. You can tailor the process, in other words, but you have to get it approved. And we said, okay, we're going to tailor it pretty much to do the opposite of what MD 102 says. That'll be our tailoring. And so we did that. We wrote it up. And then the only question is, how do you get that approved? And we had some political support. We had some support here and there. That was very helpful. But ultimately, what got us the approval was we said, well, you don't have to accept this in the general case. Let's just do this once as a pilot. And then we can look at it and see if this actually did meet all the requirements. And I knew it would. I knew that it would satisfy everybody once they saw how we were doing it. So we did it as a pilot, just a one-time exception. And after that, we kept asking for the same exception every time around. And there was no good reason to turn us down because things had worked out really well the first time, as we knew they would.
It's
Nice.
fascinating. It's fascinating how you need to set some kind of precedence. I mean, the law works like that, right? There's a precedence and an exception, and that opens doors. It reminds me years and years ago, we had an example where we had to deal with procurement, and it was like, oh, you have to work with those people. Those are the only lists of people you can work with, unless it's something they can't deliver. And then it was all about requirements to shifting them to a point where they couldn't deliver, and therefore we could actually pick our own suppliers, which we needed to because we needed to produce a high performance prototype, and it was just impossible to do it given. So it's the same thing. It's interesting
Yeah.
how to
Right.
understanding the
There's a
system.
reason why
Yeah.
I was going to say there's a reason why you need to establish that precedent. And it's because the bureaucracy is not just dreamed up by some evil person. I mean, the bureaucracy is there for a reason. And so every piece of bureaucracy has its goal. There's something it's trying to accomplish. And what you have to do is show that there's a different way to accomplish the same goal that's leaner. And that is the trick of the razor, essentially. Here's, if you want to implement a certain control through the bureaucracy, fine, We'll just show you a different way to implement that goal, to accomplish that goal, that control or whatever it is. And so you have to show a demonstration that you are accomplishing that same goal, achieving the same control. And once you've done that, then it's a lot easier for people to accept.
I mean, this is interesting because my background is a lot in design, as much as I've been a technologist and work with code and hardware and software in my life. But you know, the practice of service design is a particular one because it looks a lot at qualitative things rather than quantitative things. It does so equally, but it's quite challenged as a practice in organizations to be valued enough. And designers, I think, are generally not great at, you know, describing the contribution to the bottom line necessarily, or talk in those numbers. But it's changing. It's actually in this interesting to see how the practice is changing.
Mm-hmm.
In that
Yeah.
sense, though, what I wanted to ask actually is that there's obviously a part where the way you measure and then to achieve certain things is the thing to hit. So if you do that, you're compliant, they're gonna be happy. In I think at least two of your examples in the book, there's one you talk about a map that's pinned down on I think in the kitchen space or something. It's like, oh yeah, just use the map, you can have it, use it, and then someone didn't bring it back, and then the natural reaction was like, well, let's put a list of people who borrowed it with time and space and on it and whatever. And then your response was like, no, why don't we just adjust our behavior for the same outcome? And it's similar when you talk about how you were disproven that you're actually doing Scrum because you deviated and actually made your Scrum more efficient, but you deviated from the stone tablets of the Agile consortium and basically adjusted it, and then the bureaucrats told you off.
Right.
How does behavior play in, like where you can say, right, there's certain things you can cover with rules and others you can actually bring value or be compliant with behavior? How do you stay lean and say, right, we can achieve the same with just being better at focusing and putting some energy into our behavior? We'll still achieve the goal. We don't have to develop rule. How do you just stay away and keep the bureaucracy leaner, so to speak?
Yeah. So I distinguish between two different things here. There are places where you have to have bureaucracy and you can make the bureaucracy leaner. And then there are other places where you don't need the bureaucracy at all. So in the first example, you need the bureaucracy because you have to have formal controls of some sort. So, for example, in any environment where you have regulatory oversight and compliance requirements, maybe you have Sarbanes-Oxley compliance and you have HIPAA compliance and things like that, you absolutely have to have bureaucracy, I think. There's no way to be compliant with those things without having formal controls and formal sign-offs, formal rules, formal rigid roles to sign off on things. That's the essence of bureaucracy. You need to establish that you have controls over things, that you're applying those controls, and that somebody can sign off that the controls were applied. Essentially, that's what those frameworks are about. So, sure, you need bureaucracy there. Another place where you need bureaucracy, I love to give this example because it's so foreign from the way most people think about it, but marketing and branding. So a brand can have a
Mhm.
tremendous amount of value, let's say Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Amazon. And in order for your brand to have value, you have to have strict rules around how it's used and how it's expressed. So you say everything we publish has to be in this font, and the logo has to look like this, and it can only be combined with other logos in the following way, and you need to get approval if you want to combine the logo with something else. And this is bureaucracy. It's a perfect example of bureaucracy, and it's very valuable because it makes your brand much more valuable. I'll give you one more example that's another counterintuitive one, which is my employees were unionized when I was working in the government. And we had a collective bargaining agreement with the union. And the collective bargaining agreement was this huge piece of bureaucracy, but imposed by the employees on management. So it said things like employee cubicles have to be a certain size, and before management can make any change that affects working conditions, they have to publish a certain disclosure, and the union's allowed to bargain on it, et cetera. All this is bureaucracy. It's beautiful bureaucracy, but it's meant to make sure employees are treated fairly, et cetera. So again, there for a good reason, arguably. So anyway, those are cases where the bureaucracy is essential. However, you can often implement the goals of that piece of bureaucracy in a leaner way. So, just because Sarbanes-Oxley says you have to have controls over your financial performance, it doesn't say that you have to stand on your head 10 times, before you write any financial statement. That would be a waste, standing on your head 10 times. Obviously you can fulfill that in a lean way or a bloated way. And you should always be looking for leaner ways to do those things. Now, in the example that you cite, the thing pinned to the wall in the team room, there the need for bureaucracy is not clear. So having the sign out sheet and logging what time you took it and all of those things, yes, it will make it possible to find that piece of paper when it goes missing. However, it imposes a cost, because all bureaucracy imposes a cost, and is the risk of losing the paper again and the cost to try to find it, does that justify the additional cost you're going to put on everybody who tries to use that piece of paper by imposing the bureaucracy? And my answer was no, it's not worthwhile. We'd do better to encourage people to do the right thing and save our money, essentially save our time, instead of going through the bureaucracy. So both patterns of thinking are important when you're working in a bureaucracy.
So I worked for an advertising agency in London, and the client was Big Pharma, and we were doing innovation. And innovation around pharma, around patients, is tricky in the best of times. And I said every good idea that we had was always attempted to be killed by the three knives. The three knives were legal, regulatory, and compliance. And then the last year, I worked for an offshoot, a freestanding entity of a bank. And I got a fourth knife, and the fourth knife was called risk. So legal, regulatory, compliance, and risk
Yeah.
became the killers of all ideas. How do you help an organization move from, as you say, regulatory troll or bureaucratic
Bureaucratic trolls.
trolls to bureaucratic enablement? And then as the cherry on the cake, because I'm afraid this might be your last question we have time for, please tell us the story of red tape.
Okay. Well, I think you said the key word yourself there, risk. We put a lot of obstacles in the way of innovation because innovation is risky by nature. When you're trying something new, you don't have any past to rely on. So you're always speculating about the innovation and how it's going to change your business or how it's going to succeed. So you put controls in place to manage that risk. So there are a couple of ways you can fix that or improve that situation. For me, the biggest one is reducing the risk. So if there's less risk, you need less bureaucracy and less people saying no to everything. And there are ways you can reduce risk. One is to work with minimum viable product and then work incrementally after that and stage your funding so you're not fully investing in the innovation at first. You're waiting for it to prove itself. Or to have a portfolio of innovations and only invest in the ones that seem the most promising after you get started with them. Those are risk mitigating. The automated controls and guardrails I talked about before, those can be very risk mitigating. Working in the cloud, to my AWS position, hugely risk mitigating, because if you're working, let's say, in your own data center, when you want to try something new, you're going to spend a lot of money up front to develop the capabilities, to get the infrastructure into your data center, things like that. All of that is at risk if it turns out the idea doesn't work out. So that's a very highly risky environment. Whereas if you work in the cloud, you can get access to infrastructure quickly, try whatever it is to prove out your idea. If it doesn't work out, you just dispose of the infrastructure and stop paying for it. If you need different infrastructure, you can change it at any moment. If you need advanced capabilities like machine learning or augmented reality, virtual reality, you don't have to spend a long time developing them yourself with all the risk that that involves. You just get them off the shelf as building blocks in the cloud. So again, hugely risk mitigating. So the first trick to getting that bureaucracy out of your way is to reduce the risk of it. The second trick is to value agility and innovation because they have business value per se.
Mhm.
So we often don't evaluate. So, for example, if you're going to make changes to your IT code and infrastructure and so on, so that you will be more agile in the future, or so that you'll be able to make changes more quickly in the future. How do you make the business case for that? How do you establish the value of that? Because you don't know what kind of return you're going to get from it. In fact, you don't even know how you're going to use the agility. Nevertheless, it's
Mhm.
clear that it has value. Being able to respond more quickly in the future, and the other things you get with agility, that has value to a business. It's just that you can't project it the same way that you project other business cases. It's more, as I explain in various places in my books, it's more like valuing a financial option. It's like a call option,
Mhm.
or it's a risk reducer. You can think of it a few different ways. But in order to avoid that no saying bureaucracy, you have to establish that there is value, business value, in saying yes to things, and in
Yeah.
saying yes in general, and having a process that lets new innovations get tried out. And that's a little hard for companies to get used to sometimes. Oh,
Yeah.
and you asked me about red
And tell us,
Red tape.
red
yes, the red
tape.
tape.
So I learned a lot of things when I was researching this book. um, I learned a lot about Napoleon and bureaucracy, and ancient Egypt and bureaucracy. And one of the things I learned along the way that I shared in the book is where the expression red tape comes from. And obviously, red tape is one of those things we hate about bureaucracy. Its origin, though, is not so horrible. It actually dates back to the Emperor Charles V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the King of Spain, and he had a few other titles that I can't remember. This was in the 16th century. And he instituted this really big innovation in government, which is that for his important laws, instead of tying the scroll up with string, he would put red tape around it so everybody would know it was important. So that's where red tape comes from, actually.
Lovely. I think so. We now got even a couple of 100 years old history lesson right then and there.
You
Brilliant.
never know what you're going to hear from me.
I think in general, look, having run this podcast now for nearly a year and with nearly 50 episodes now, it's brilliant. It's the best benefit of it. I think in this case in particular, it's very refreshing to see a very nuanced view on this to go, and you might have written that for your publisher, but you don't love or hate it. I think that applies to a lot of things in life where you go, you don't have to love or hate anything. It's just, it's there. Got to deal with it. The way you deal with it is up to you. And here are some examples of what you can do and what actually works, which is brilliant. So we really loved the book for that. And yeah, you if you would have been there 5-10 minutes before the recording, we were in a quite a intense conversation about it, some of the aspects. So it's a great book. And thank you so much for your insights and for your stories and for spending some time with us. So Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.